everyone, and welcome to the lineup. Today is May the 5th, 2022. That's right, it's Cinco de Mayo. And by the way, just for your information, Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day. It actually celebrates a victory over the French armies by the Mexican armies in 1862 at the Battle of the Puebla. And so let's just make sure we keeping things straight for the sake of those who are commemorating this great victory in Mexico and those of a Mexican heritage. So also, let me just say thank you for your continued prayers. My hope and plan is to be back at Calvary Chapel Tustin this Sunday morning, looking at our word for the year, which is love, from the greatest sermon ever preached, and that being the Sermon on the Mount. And if you'd like to join us online, that's 7:45, 9:30, or 11:30 at cctustin.org, or on my personal Facebook page, or my public figure Facebook page, I should say. You can join us there, and it will be later posted on YouTube. A really powerful word from the Lord about love and loving your enemies, something I think that's very timely, including in light of our very first story, which you've all heard about it. Everybody's talking about it. I've chosen an article from the Epoch Times where the headline reads, "Egregious Breach of Trust. Supreme Court Marshal to investigate leak of draft Roe v. Wade opinion." U.S. Chief Justice John Roberts has directed the Marshal of the Supreme Court to launch an investigation to determine the source of the leak of its draft opinion on its pending Roe v. Wade case to Politico. In a statement on May 3rd, the nation's top court confirmed the majority draft opinion was authentic, but said it did not represent a decision by the court or the final position of any member on the issues in the case. The statement also said the circulation of draft opinions internally was routine and essential part of its confidential deliberative work. Roberts described the leak as a betrayal of the confidences of the court that intended to undermine the integrity of its operations, but, he said, it would not succeed. The work of the court, he went on to say, will not be affected in any way. We at the court are blessed to have a workforce, permanent employees and law clerks alike, intensely loyal to the institution and dedicated to the rule of law. Court employees have an exemplary and important tradition of respecting the confidentiality of the judicial process and upholding the trust of the court. This was a singular and egregious breach of trust that is an affront to the court and the community of public servants who work here. Now, this is kind of interesting because I've seen headlines and reporters say and use the term unprecedented, and this is not unprecedented because rather interestingly, there was a leak in 1973 of the court's decision to uphold Roe v. Wade. And so you have to wonder, and, as he's saying, it's an egregious breach of trust. Well, maybe it was actually a test the waters type of thing, and it was an intentional leak, as some have proposed, which is a possibility, to see what the response of the public is going to be if the Supreme Court were to send the decision back to the hands of the state and the voter on the matter of the right to choose to kill your unborn child. So interesting that we're seeing this type of thing happen in this particular season of history, as it seems, as we talk about frequently, just everything is advancing at breakneck speed to the point where the only hope for things to stop their downward spiral is for God to remove the church and judge the world. So just an amazing time that we're seeing the discussions here. And I have to say, it's unbelievable to me, and I know to most of you, to see somebody get upset and scream and yell at protecting unborn children in the womb. And, one of the most important things I think for us to point out is that there were no ultrasound machines in 1973 that could tell those who were looking at a baby inside of a mother's womb that it had fingernails and toes and could move and had facial expressions and eyelashes and all the other things that we now know to be factual and scientific. And, this crowd that's always screaming about the science, still concludes that inside the mother's womb is a blob of tissue. Well, blobs of tissue do not have fingernails and toes and hands and facial expressions and even emotional responses and the response to touch and all these other things that we know now without question are happening inside of a mother's womb with the unborn child. So science says it's a baby. And by the way, I always find it to be interesting that they call it, they like to have as their banner it's not a baby, it's a fetus. Well, fetus is a Latin word for baby or a small child. So, the foolishness is exposed even within their own self refuting argument. Now, a lot has been said about this particular issue, including from people in high places of power. And the Washington Examiner is reporting that Biden says radical Supreme Court decision on abortion endangers gay marriage. President Joe Biden told reporters Tuesday that the leaked Supreme Court opinion on overturning Roe v. Wade could pave the way for decisions undermining various other policies, including same sex marriage. Earlier in the day, Biden vowed to oppose the ruling whenever it is handed down, called for voters to elect pro choice lawmakers, and asked Congress to pass legislation codifying Roe, the 1973 decision legalizing abortion nationwide. It concerns me a great deal that we're going to, after 50 years, decide that a woman doesn't have a right to choose, Biden told reporters on his way to a visit to the Lockheed Martin facility in Troy, Alabama. If this decision holds, it's really quite a radical decision, Biden said, who is a Catholic and said he is personally anti abortion, but respects a woman's right to have the procedure. And his comments mark the first time he has said the word abortion since being sworn in as president. If the court does overturn Roe, it will fall on our nation's elected officials at all levels of government to protect a woman's right to choose. Well, let's just pause there because abortion stops a beating heart. Abortion kills a human child. No one has the right to do that. It isn't anybody's right. It isn't about reproductive rights or any of those things. And I saw, a very well-known radio host. I won't even repeat his name. He's just a vile person. His show is filthy and all these other things. But he said, basically what this says is that people don't want to protect the victims of rape. And again, the number of abortions that are the result of rape are well below 1% and minuscule in number in comparison to those who are using it as a form of birth control and killing a living human being. And let me also just pause and say, I know a lot of people have made this decision prior to being born again. I know there's a lot of women who aren't born again, who have had just hours and hours and months and years of counseling, realizing what they have done. And the truth is, God is a gracious and loving God, and He restores and heals and repairs the mind and gives peace to the heart and mind through Christ Jesus. So it's not the unpardonable sin by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a horrific blight on our culture and society today. And Biden, basically is saying, well, this could lead to other egregious things happening, like the overturning of gay marriage. Well, God said, and by the way, this is His planet. He is the manufacturer of human beings. He has limited the gender count to 2, male and female. He has created them and reproductive capabilities. He has limited or reproductive rights, I should say. The right to have children is restricted to male and female married couples only. All sexual activity outside of that, God has determined to be sin. You may not like it. You may disagree with it, but you'll have to take it up with Him. Don't take it up with me. I'm not the one that wrote it. God is the one who has said it and commanded it. Breitbart says Joe Biden says the Constitution gives right to abort a child. Mainstream religions agree with Roe v. Wade. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again. There was a bumper sticker, or a sticker, I should say, on a friend's cubicle when I worked in an office setting some years ago that said, "I can tell you're lying because your lips are moving." And that would be a fitting byline to this particular statement. Mainstream religions agree with Roe v. Wade. President Joe Biden further reacted to a leaked draft opinion from the Supreme Court on Tuesday, criticizing the radical argument against a constitutional right to abortion. No, the Constitution does not guarantee anyone a right to abortion. It gives everybody the guarantee to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, including those inside the womb developing all the way through the gestation period of being born as a living and viable human being. And why all of a sudden? Where's the science that says that it's not a human child? Where's the science that says we don't, when after thousands of years, everybody called that a baby inside of a mother's womb? Where's the science that all of a sudden says, well, actually, now we know it's not a baby? When the reality is, science actually proves it is absolutely a human baby. And, this whole thing, it's just so indicative of what the Lord said the last days would be like: perilous times, people being lovers of themselves and haters of God. Excuse me. The idea that we're going to make a judgment that's going to say that no one can make a judgment to choose to abort a child based on a decision by the Supreme Court, I think goes way overboard, Biden said. I wish you would listen to what he just said. He said it's a child. Choose to abort a child. A child is a human child. A child is a human being. No one has the right to kill another human being. There are consequences to that. And yet, just the oblivion, the ridiculousness of the argument just continues from even the highest office in the land. The president spoke to reporters about the draft opinion as he left Washington, D.C. for a trip to Alabama to visit a Lockheed Martin manufacturing facility. And during his remarks, Biden falsely claimed that all mainstream religions believe the beginning of human life is open to interpretation. Look, think what Rose says. Rose says what all the basic mainstream religions have historically concluded, that the existence of a human life and being is a question. Is it at the moment of conception? Is it at 6 months? Is it 6 weeks? The president failed to mention that the Catholic Church, of which he claims to be a member, teaches that life begins at the moment of conception. Now, this again is an argument that needs to be made. If you don't know when life begins, then you should not end the life of the one in the womb. And again, just the delusional element of this thinking is just beyond our understanding. And I've said this before. I believe it was actually Dr. Thomas Ice who initially made the statement, what problem do you have that the rapture wouldn't solve? And these emotional problems, these problems that we're all having with the world we live in, our minds and our hearts being broken, and in disbelief of what's happening in the world, a moment and a twinkling of an eye experience would be a great thing to happen, perhaps even today. Come get us, Lord Jesus. And I hope you're all out there saying amen. Now, many things going on in the world that tell us that we are moving towards their fulfillment during the tribulation period. And our next article endorses the fact that we know that there's going to be economic struggles in the last days, and especially on into the tribulation period. It will reach its zenith. And the Wall Street Journal is telling us that the Fed lifts rates by a half point, which is the biggest hike since 2000. The Federal Reserve approved a rare half percentage point interest rate increase and announced plans to shrink its $9 trillion asset portfolio starting next month in a double-barreled effort to reduce inflation that is running at a 4-decade high. The moves, announced after a 2-day policy meeting Wednesday, will raise the central bank's benchmark federal funds rate to a target range between 0.75% and 1%. Together, the steps mark the most aggressive Fed tightening of monetary policy at one meeting in decades, aimed at rapidly reducing the economic stimulus that has contributed to rising price pressures. The Fed, which usually lifts interest rates in quarter percentage point increments, last raised rates by half a point in 2000. U.S. stocks wobbled and Treasury yields held steady after the Fed released its policy statement. Excuse me. Well, the reality is, when the Fed starts printing money, inflation is soon to follow. And we've had just these massive printings of funds to distribute during the pandemic. And, who's to argue about these relief funds and how they did indeed help people? There's no question about it. But, looking at this and now here seeing the end result of it, it's like the old adage, history proves that man learns nothing from history. You print money, there's going to be inflation. And the Wall Street Journal is also reporting that the EU proposes a ban on Russian oil imports, sending prices higher. So we've got higher interest rates to the tune of a half a point, and now we see prices soaring once again in the oil markets. The European Union proposed a ban on imports of Russian crude within 6 months and on refined oil products from the country by year end, prompting a jump in oil prices. while the bloc is set to impose sanctions on high-ranking Russian military officials involved in alleged war crimes and the siege of Mariupol. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen outlined the proposal in a speech to the European Parliament and said the EU's executive body is also proposing to take Russia's biggest bank, SureBank, and the two other Russian banks off the SWIFT financial messaging system. The Commission is also planning to ban three major Russian state-owned broadcasters from the EU. EU member states immediately entered difficult discussions over the sanctions package Wednesday morning, with Hungary repeating its call for a slower transition away from Russian oil, while Poland and the Baltic states saying the phase out of oil was too slow. All 27 countries would need to sign off on the package for it to go into effect. EU officials are pushing for a decision this week. And the Journal reported on Tuesday that Hungary and Slovakia, two countries that are heavily dependent on Russian oil deliveries, will have 20 months to stop imports. And with all these steps, we are depriving the Russian economy from its ability to diversify and modernize. And Putin wanted to wipe Ukraine from the map. He will clearly not succeed, Ms. von der Leyen said. Oil prices jumped on the announcement, as we mentioned a moment ago. Now, it's interesting to see, this politicking going on. We're going to do something and it's going to cripple them. And it's 20 months away. And who knows how long this Ukraine violation of their sovereign territory is going to go on by the Russians. But it's unlikely that it's going to continue 20 months out. So again, this is just saber rattling and the typical politicizing and getting 27 EU members to sign off on this thing with nations that are heavily dependent on Russian energy products is beyond unlikely. But it does look like something out there on the political front, as though they are going to do something that's going to cripple the Russians. The Wall Street Journal is also reporting, and this I find to be interesting, and we'll pause here and make a point after this, that American consumers are shopping, traveling, and working out like it's 2019. In early 2020, many companies said the pandemic would change everything for consumers, and it did for a while. Now, many Americans are resuming their pre-pandemic habits, rocking out at crowded concerts, doing deadlifts next to strangers at the gym, and stocking a standard supply of toilet paper. Airlines, restaurants, and childcare centers, which relied on government loans to stay afloat during the COVID-19 peak, can now hardly keep up with demand. Live Nation, which owns Ticketmaster, said concert sales were up 45% as of February 2022, compared with the same period in 2019, the last full pre-pandemic year. As of February, the company had 30% more concerts planned for 2022 than 2019. Membership levels at gym chain Planet Fitness in January surpassed pre-pandemic levels, followed by a stretch in which some 25% of the nation's gyms closed, according to industry data. Over 2 million people traveled by plane each day on average between April 17 and 23. According to the Transportation Security Administration, that figure averaged about 2.4 million in 2019. And at the same time, some pandemic stars like Peloton Interactive Inc., Netflix Inc., and Instacart Inc. have taken hits. From hoping that customers had permanently shifted their behavior, the companies are now considering previously unthinkable changes. Netflix, hit with its first membership decline in a decade, is considering offering a lower-priced ad-supported version. Peloton, losing money and saddled with excess equipment, is lowering the price of its stationary bikes. Instacart slashed its valuations, and the resiliency of the American consumer has been a hallmark of modern history. After events such as Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans or after the attacks of 9/11, people have shown they will snap back to doing many of their favorite things given time. Now, again, I don't want to make too much of this, but I do think it's worth noting that this article is pointing out kind of the business as usual attitude that we see in our world today. And, you can make your argument, whatever side of the pandemic coin you may be on or the vax coin you may be on and all these other things. But, there's no question about the fact people have died, and we all know that it's just been horrific for some families and catastrophic for some countries and the economy and all the other things that we're all more than aware of. But, it's interesting if you pair this with the fact that we're seeing wars and rumors of wars. We're seeing, the SCOTUS leak and all the upheaval. And we've even had an individual security officer, I believe it was, injured at a rally where supporters and non-supporters of this leak in the Supreme Court and the overturning of Roe v. Wade clashed. And so, I think this is indicative of what's happening in our world today, in the sense that there is, to a degree, an indifference to the impending signs of just as it was in the days of Noah. And listen, Billy Graham said, if God doesn't judge the United States of America, he owes Sodom and Gomorrah an apology. And our country, sadly, has lost its way and forgotten that we've been endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are these: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And sadly, the men who signed our Declaration of Independence, many of them seminary grads, most of them had an association with Christianity, and thus the Judeo-Christian values that have brought so much blessing to our country are being abandoned just at breakneck speed. And, the perilous times that Paul talked about in 2 Timothy chapter 3 are upon us, as are all the human character flaws that are listed there. I would encourage you to take a read through that and look at it as a checklist of our world today. And I think you'll find that we have arrived at the perilous time. 2 Timothy 3, 1-5 would be the verses there. Now, interesting that we're seeing this go on. And as I said, everybody's like, oh, well, let's just get back at it and these other things. And, there comes a time where I think, as we'll cover here in our I believe, our final or second to last story of the day, there comes a time where you have to make some decisions, that are going to be unpopular. And we've already experienced a couple of years of that, 2 weeks to slow the curve and all these other things that we see thrown around out there. But we'll come back to this thought here in a few moments, but let me just also insert this. And I was tempted to have this as our lead story, but we've got a lot of other things going on in the world today. And if we're going to talk about the last days, if we're going to talk about Bible prophecy, we're going to talk about the nation of Israel. And we're going to talk about the fact in this story that there is a generation that will not pass away until all things take place. Now, there's some debates about it and, what exactly that means. Is it a figure of speech? Is it literal? How long is a generation, and all those things? And whether or not the budding of the fig tree represents the rebirth of the nation of Israel, I do believe it does. And I do believe there is indisputable proof that that is, in fact, what Jesus was talking about in the Olivet Discourse. So when Israel buds again, as it's referred to in Joel and Hosea as the fig tree, when it buds again, that is a generation that will see everything spoken of in the Olivet Discourse take place, which I believe includes things prior to the tribulation, during the tribulation, and after, even immediately after the tribulation, where the sheep and the goats are divided. But some would like to say, well, what is a generation? Is it 80 years? Is it 90 years? Is it just to be taken as absolute literal, in that if someone was alive on May 14th, 1948, not all those people are going to die before everything happens? Well, either way, no matter how you slice it, whatever your interpretation or opinion may be, Israel is now 74 years old. Antony Blinken congratulates Israel on its 74th Independence Day, the Jewish News Syndicate is reporting. And as Israel celebrates 74 years since its independence, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken sent his congratulations in a statement on Wednesday. Blinken said the relationship between the U.S. and Israel is unshakable, based on shared democratic ideals. The United States remains steadfast in its commitment to Israel's security and deeply values our partnership in facing global challenges, including threats posed by Iran. The United States looks forward to continuing our work with Israel to create a more peaceful, secure, and prosperous Middle East, including through building additional bridges between Israel and its neighbors. The U.S. State Department has continued the previous administration's attempt to foster relationships between Israel and its Arab neighbors through the Abraham Accords. However, it has previously said that Palestinians could not be left out of the conversation. unlike the Trump administration's effort to work around the Palestinian issue when negotiating the accords. Blinken also raised the ire of Israeli leaders in stating that the U.S. is moving ahead with the reopening of the Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem, as well as moving forward with the Biden administration's efforts to re-enter the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. Well, first of all, there is no country named Palestine. Palestine in 136 AD was a name given to it by Hadrian, the Roman emperor, because of his hatred of the Jews and his frustration with the constant rebellions that were happening under his authority. And this whole Palestinian, there's no country named Palestine. So why would a non-country have a consulate in Jerusalem? It's just a typical politicking again, like we mentioned earlier, and shameful on this level. JNS is also reporting, that's the Jewish News Syndicate, sorry. Unemployment rate in the Jewish state hits a 50-year low. The unemployment rate in Israel dropped to 2.9% in the first half of April from 3.7% in March. And according to a report in the Israeli Business Daily Globes, the Central Bureau of Statistics reports a 50-year low unemployment rate in April with 120,000 job seekers and 150,000 vacancies. The workforce participation level fell to 61% in the first half of April from 61.3% in the second half of March. According to the report, the high number of job openings is likely to lead to higher salaries. And once again, we see the fact that on every level, Israel is a rose in the desert. It is blooming economically. It is a force to be reckoned with militarily. God has brought his chosen people from the areas of the world where he had scattered them himself for their rebellion against him, fulfilling Ezekiel 37 and other scriptures as well. Jeremiah talks about the return to the land as well, and the regathering of the Jews, and they are back in their national homeland, and they are being blessed by the hand of God, as he promised he would do so. And Amos even said, once they're back in the land, they will never be uprooted again. And so we don't have to worry about anybody kicking them off their land, because God had said through the prophet Amos, as I mentioned, it's not going to happen. So, but we do see his hand in this area that Mark Twain described as God-forsaken, and basically a barren land without, in his journey from one end of it to another, he said he didn't see one living thing, human or animal. And it was just a blight, so to speak, on the land. And yet here it is, a fruit-producing nation, Jews returning there from all over the world. Their economy is booming, even as we see the economy here in the U.S. and other places is struggling. God's hand of favor is clearly on them, and we need to continue to be a blessing to them, as Genesis chapter 12, verse 3 instructs us to do. Fox News is reporting that Putin issues decree to hit unfriendly nations with export blocks and potential blow to global economy. Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a retaliatory decree Tuesday to hit unfriendly states with export blocks in a move that could further hinder the global market. The move would look to terminate existing deals and restrict the export of raw materials and products from Russia that serve in the interest of certain foreign entities. The steps are in retaliation for the severe international sanctions that Russia has been hit with following its illegal invasion into Ukraine nearly 70 days ago. The bloc would allegedly protect Moscow's interests and counter unfriendly actions which contradict the international law by the United States of America and foreign states and international organizations that join them, Russian media reported. Putin alleged that the international sanctions are illegitimately depriving the Russian Federation, the citizens of the Russian Federation, the Russian legal entities of their property rights and restricting their property rights. And Putin did not list which nations or foreign groups he would specifically target, but instead called on his government to approve a list of entities that will be sanctioned within the next 10 days. And Russia has already issued retaliatory sanctions against the U.S. and other NATO allies, but the latest threat could cause a new round of economic turmoil, as it would allow Moscow to void existing deals, a move that would create global shockwaves. And again, let me remind you that under the four horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation chapter 6, we see a major economic upheaval. We see, through figurative language, where a quart of wheat or barley is going to cost a day's pay, and basically that's the equivalent of a loaf of bread. Or some would argue that it's a single meal for one person is going to cost a day's pay. So, these rumblings that we're seeing about the economy, the rising cost of oil, natural gas, and the European market. And the countermeasures that we're talking about here that Putin is seeking to employ, all of these things leading to a disastrous situation with the global economy that could very well be a part of the cause that we see under the four horsemen of the apocalypse, where food prices are so high, yet the oil and the wine, some would argue those are the food representative of the food of the rich, will not be harmed. But the ordinary, everyday person, it's going to cost them an exorbitant amount of money just to feed one person one meal. And so here, inflation, this economic combat that's going on, coupled with a lot of the other cyber activity we're seeing going on in our world that can destroy economies or block one's own access to their own financial resources, which what Putin is accusing nations of the world doing. And to say nothing of the fact that both Ukraine and Russia combined are known as the breadbasket of Europe. So our next story, or a couple stories down, I should say, is going to underscore the fact that we are very likely approaching what's going to be fulfilled during the tribulation, early in the tribulation, according to Revelation chapter 6. Now, we're talking a lot of late about Big Brother in 1984 and all the other things that, we're now seeing become realities. And the Gateway Pundit is reporting a story along those lines where the headline reads, the CDC used phone location data to monitor churches and schools to determine whether Americans followed COVID lockdown orders. Well, I think the first thing we have to ask is, since when did the CDC become a law enforcement agency? The CDC cannot issue decrees. It cannot tell anybody what to do. It simply reports on medical data about diseases around the world, and all of a sudden it's become part of the legislative branch of the U.S. government somehow. And now they're using phone location data to monitor churches and schools to see if they're following lockdown orders. The CDC used phone location data, the article says, to track millions of Americans in 2021. They monitored curfew zones, churches, schools, neighbor-to-neighbor visits, and trips to pharmacies through SafeGraph, a controversial data broker. The CDC purchased the phone data and used COVID-19 as an excuse to buy the data more quickly and in larger quantities, according to documents exclusively obtained by Motherboard through a Freedom of Information Act request. And the CDC used the data to determine whether Americans were complying with COVID lockdown orders. The documents revealed the expansive plan the CDC has had last year to use location data from a highly controversial data broker, SafeGraph. The company, the CDC, paid $420,000 for access to 1 year of data to includes Peter Thiel and the former head of the Saudi intelligence among its investors. Google banned the company from the Play Store in June, and the CDC bought access to location data harvested from tens of millions of phones in the U.S. to perform analysis of compliance with curfews, track patterns of people visiting K through 12 schools, and specifically monitor the effectiveness of the policy in the Navajo Nation, according to CDC documents obtained by Motherboard. The documents also show that although the CDC used COVID-19 as a reason to buy access to the data more quickly, it intended to use it for more general CDC purposes. Now, we do know during the tribulation period, there's going to be a monitoring of all activities, specifically financial activity, that's going to be monitored by a mark on the hand or forehead associated with the name or the number of the name of the first beast, one we call the Antichrist. So, normalizing these things is what we're seeing happening in our world today. And, we've heard all kinds of stories. I'm sure most of you have heard some of the sensational things reported about the vaccine and that it's the mark of the beast and all this stuff. And, first of all, it's not the mark of the beast because there is no beast. But it is normalizing the acceptance of and indoctrinating cultures to accept the acceptance of national mandates like these, where you can't conduct business unless you have a vaccine card or this or that, which is exactly what's going to happen during the tribulation period. And there's going to be an obvious monitoring system if you're not allowed to buy or sell. And this just reminds us that, we're not waiting for something to develop technologically for this to be a possibility that's fulfilled during the tribulation. It's already here. And not only is it already here, it's already happening. And we've seen these social credit scores that we talked about last week and in the past, and people, being monitored by for their activities and their compliance, and all these other things happening. And the world is headed to basic global rule under one particular man. And let me just mention again, the church is not going to be here. This is a time of God's wrath. And, there's people who like to make the argument that and they make the case for the rapture being pre-wrath, or at the midpoint of the tribulation after the abomination of desolation. But we have to remember that God's wrath takes on various forms, and it's not strictly the catastrophic or cataclysmic wrath of God. All the activities we see, the demon horde coming up from the pit that stings people, and they desire to die, and torments men for 5 months, and all these other things we see happening, the asteroid and the comet strikes that are going to strike the earth. We also have to remember that the wrath of God is also manifested in the rise of the Antichrist to power, and him ceasing to hinder his ability by the removal of the church and its purifying and preserving influence in the world. So the whole tribulation is the wrath of God. So, when we start talking about these things and their potential fulfillment, it ought to stir us up to make sure we're looking up and realizing that our redemption is nigh. For the dead in Christ, the redemption of their bodies; for the alive in Christ, the putting on instantaneously of an immortal, incorruptible version of these lowly bodies, as Philippians 3:20-21 tells us is going to happen. And this is an exciting time, and we ought to look at these things through the lens of, both disgust and aggravation and frustration, but never despair, because the Bible told us these things are going to come to pass. And in these last days, they will be rampant and even dominant. And the things that are necessary for the implementation of systems like the global monitoring of all economic activity have to be in place in order for them to happen. The tribulation isn't long enough for them to be developed during that time. They have to be in place prior to it. And they indeed are. Jesus is coming for us soon. Now, another story I'd like to throw out there, because I've always been interested in, the Revelation 16 and the Son being given power to scorch men's bodies. And we've talked multiple times about what exactly that means. I believe that, as some would say, some would see that there was some type of activity with a particular star, it becoming a giant, and, scorching men's bodies, and the sun, having some type of permanent change and all those things. I don't believe that that's the case, because it's short-lived. We know that after the sun is given the power to scorch men's bodies, that there is a cold that is unbearably painful, or darkness that is unbearably painful, that follows it. With that darkness certainly would be cold. But the reality is, I believe that what Revelation chapter 16 is talking about, with the sun being given power to scorch men's bodies, is a coronal mass ejection, or what many would dub to be a solar flare. And I thought this interesting because we've been seeing an increase in activity under this or along these lines. But space.com, one of the websites I frequent to monitor this activity, has an article that is headlined by this, where it says, "Why so much solar activity? Sun may be outpacing predictions." Even after centuries of observations, the sun can still surprise scientists, the article says. It's no coincidence that the headlines have been full of solar flares and storms. Solar Cycle 25, as astronomers call it, is now well underway. Solar activity, which space weather experts measure by the number of visible sunspots, rises and falls on a cycle that lasts roughly 11 years from minimum to minimum, although one cycle can be as short as 9 years or as long as 13. The sun's new cycle is about 2 years in and should peak around 2025. Although cycle 25 is expected to be stronger than its predecessor, it is still predicted to be feebler than average. There's a few predictions that cycle 25 might be strong, but we'll wait and see, says Mark Meesh, a space weather observer at the University of Colorado of Boulder, or at Boulder. He told space.com. Looking at the progression of the latest trend cycle, cycle 25's intensity might seem to be higher than expected. This apparently high activity is partly because the cycle began around 6 months earlier than scientists had anticipated, a natural difference, according to Mish, who told space.com that this cycle so far is still within the range of most predictions. And current trends point to the sun having about 125 sunspots when cycle 25 peaks. That's more than 115 sunspots visible at the peak of cycle 24, but much lower than 180 of cycle 23, which peaked in March of 2000 and was about in the middle of those in recorded history. But again, this just points out the fact that they really don't know. I mean, there are patterns and there are averages and all the things, but the observation cycle isn't that long. As you can see, we're only in cycle 25, and this cycle has been going on for thousands of years. There's no question about it. So it doesn't mean that there's necessarily a progression, where it's a slow buildup. There can be, just as they're pointing out, an abnormal solar cycle where all of a sudden you've got massive sunspots, coronal mass ejections that bombard the Earth with radioactive ions, potentially even breaking down the magnetosphere that protects the Earth and deflects these bombardments, and breaking it down, allowing the sun to directly impact people on Earth. Now, what would a direct coronal mass ejection that has broken down the magnetosphere have as an impact on people? Well, first of all, it would eliminate all electronic devices and activity here on the planet, disable all computers and computer systems and computer operated systems, but it would also give the sun the power to scorch men's bodies with radiation burns all over their bodies. And that's why I think if we look at the continuation of the Revelation chapter 16 scenario, the next thing that happens is this darkness, and people gnaw their tongues in pain because of the darkness. Now, if you think about it, cold weather is dry weather. And what happens to your skin in dry weather? Well, it begins to crack, and the moisture levels drop. And so if you've got a burn, the worst thing that could happen would be for the weather to, basically the humidity to drop to a degree where it's so cold, your skin begins to crack and people gnaw their tongues in pain. So again, that's, speculation. But I do believe that what's going to happen during the tribulation is not that the earth is hit by a star or any of these other things happening to our sun. I believe what's going to happen is there's going to be a solar cycle that is massive in comparison to what's happened in the past. Now, Bloomberg is reporting that world hunger is exploding even after a 25% spike before the Ukraine war. The global hunger crisis is exploding as Ukraine sends prices of key staples. The Ukraine war sends prices of key staples even higher following a 25% spike in food insecurity last year. The comment from chief economists at the World Food Program came as the Global Network Against Food Crisis warned that the hunger problem is expected to deteriorate further this year. A gauge of world food prices has soared to a record as the Ukraine war disrupts harvests and exports from one of the world's top grain and vegetable oil supporters. The world is exploding with food insecurity, said the WFP's Arif Hussein on Wednesday at a press briefing. And almost 193 million people across 53 countries or territories suffered acute food insecurity in 2021, meaning their lack of meals posed an immediate threat to their lives or livelihoods. That's up from 155 million in 55 countries for the prior year, and a record in the 6 years since the report began. Conflicts in countries like Ethiopia and Afghanistan have worsened the crises there, and economic shocks from the COVID-19 pandemic curbed food access in almost 24 nations, the International Alliance said in a report. Extreme weather, like the severe drought in Madagascar, is also exacerbating the problem. And a gauge of world food prices has soared about, get this, 75% since 2020. Now, let me pause there a moment and remind us that, we often talk about the Lord coming quickly, and that simply means suddenly or shortly. And we also see that in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, that John was told things that would happen shortly, and that means suddenly and in quick succession once they begin. And so, you look at this and this exponential rise in food prices since mid 2020. Prices on food around the world have risen 75%, eclipsing levels seen in 2008 and 11 that contributed to global food crises, piling pressure on governments from Sri Lanka to Peru. The invasion of Ukraine is also sparking a wave of protectionism as some exporters curb overseas crop sales to ensure local supplies. And this war will have severe consequences on global food security as millions of Ukrainians are displaced and many import dependent countries can't get stable crops or fertilizers from Ukraine and Russia, according to the report. And again, pointing back to Revelation chapter 6 and the four horsemen of the apocalypse, we do know that the second rider, the rider on the red horse, is given power to take peace from the earth, and people would butcher each other. And then we see further down the line that the beasts of the earth and people are killing each other over the food supply shortage. And I think this is worth noting because we actually live in a time where things are far different than they were the last time the United States experienced a Great Depression where food supplies were short and the economy was devastated after the Wall Street crash of 29. And people are not, many of us have seen pictures of those standing in soup lines, very orderly. And, the people were obviously distraught over the situation and wanting to work and all these other things. But we live in a different day. We live in the perilous times we mentioned earlier of 2 Timothy chapter 3, where people are lovers of themselves and they're not really concerned about whether or not somebody else has it. They're more concerned about their right to it, as we see being manifested in so many ways today. Now, our last story again gives a rather sad commentary on the spiritual state of things here in our country today, in the U.S. that is, and really around the world. And the story comes from the Associated Press. And the headline reads, Satanic Temple requests Boston City Hall fly flag celebrating Satanic Appreciation Week. Hal Shurtleff, the man who filed a lawsuit against the city of Boston after its leaders refused to allow a Christian flag to fly in conjunction with several other groups' flags, weighs in on the Supreme Court's ruling of the case. The Satanic Temple is requesting to fly a flag over Boston City Hall following the recent Supreme Court ruling that the city violated the free speech rights of the conservative group that previously sought to fly a Christian flag over the government building. The Satanic Temple replies to the Supreme Court ruling and found Boston violated First Amendment rights by refusing to fly the flag, stating that they want to celebrate Satanic Appreciation Week from July 23rd to 29. The city had approved 284 consecutive applications to fly flags before rejecting Shurtleff's request. And under our precedents and in view of our government speech holding here, that refusal discriminated based on religious viewpoint. It violated the free speech clause, Justice Stephen Breyer wrote in the court's opinion. The spokesperson added that the mayor's office is carefully reviewing the court's decision and its recognition of city governments to operate similar programs. Now, just think about the title of this week, Satanic Appreciation Week. The only thing I appreciate about anything to do with the devil is that Jesus is going to throw him in the bottomless pit, the lake of fire, and he's going to remain there forever and ever and ever. Somebody say amen. Now, the Daily Caller, and this is an interesting story, and it kind of leans to what many have felt throughout these past couple of years. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, finally admits we should treat COVID-19 like the flu. Top officials at the Food and Drug Administration wrote Monday that going forward, Americans will have to accept COVID-19 as another respiratory virus like influenza. The FDA Commissioner Robert Califf, Principal Deputy Commissioner Janet Woodstock, and the agency's top vaccine official, Dr. Peter Marks, wrote that COVID-19 will be in circulation for the foreseeable future and must be accepted as another common virus in the Journal of American Medical Association. Like with influenza, this new reality will likely require annual COVID-19 shots to be tailored around the most threatening strains of the virus, the officials wrote. Widespread vaccine and infection reduced immunity combined with the availability of effective therapeutics could blunt the effects of future outbreaks. Nonetheless, it is time to accept that the presence of SARS CoV 2, the virus that causes COVID 19, is the new normal, officials wrote. It will likely circulate globally for the foreseeable future, taking its place alongside other common respiratory viruses such as influenza, and it will likely require similar annual consideration for vaccine composition updates in consultation with the FDA. In the earliest days of the pandemic, some elected officials and commentators attempted to equate COVID 19 to the flu, but the coronavirus pandemic turned out to be far deadlier, killing nearly 1 million Americans. However, since vaccines for the virus became widely available last year, the threat of mortality from COVID 19 has trended closer to seasonal influenza, although the former has been far more contagious. Now, this following story, and our last story for our time together today, is interesting in that we've talked about it before, but we need to bring this up again because this is where we're living and what we see going on in the room, and that is, or in the world, I should say, certainly in our country, and that is the effort to control the narrative, including about what we just read that the FDA stated. Somebody's going to spin that story. Somebody's going to say the FDA somebody misquoted or made the story up or something because they have to control the narrative in order to control the masses. Zero Hedge says Homeland Security's disinformation board is even more pernicious than it seems. The most egregious and blatant official disinformation campaign in the U.S. took place 3 weeks before the 2020 presidential election, and that was when dozens of former intelligence officials purported to believe that the authentic emails regarding Joe Biden's activities in China and Ukraine reported by the New York Post were Russian disinformation. The quasi-official proclamation enabled liberal corporate media outlets to uncritically mock and then ignore those emails as Russian disinformation and pressured big tech platforms such as Facebook and Twitter to censor the reporting at exactly the time Americans were preparing to decide who would be the next U.S. president. The letter from these former intelligence officials was orchestrated by trained career liars, disinformation agents such as former CIA Director John Brennan and former Director of the National Intelligence James Clapper. Yet that letter was nonetheless crucial to discredit and ultimately suppress the New York Post incriminating reporting on Biden. It provided a quasi-official imprimatur, something that could be predicted as an authoritative degree that these authentic emails were in fact fraudulent. After all, if all these noble and heroic intelligence operatives who spent their lives studying Russian disinformation were insisting the Biden emails had all the hallmarks of Kremlin treachery, who possessed the credibility to dispute their expert assessment? The same strategic motive to vest accusations of disinformation with the veneer of expertise is what has fostered a new, very well-financed industry heralding itself as composed of anti-disinformation scholars. Knowing that Americans are inculcated from childhood to believe that censorship is nefarious, that is the hallmark of tyranny, those who wish to censor need to find some ennobling rationale to justify it and disguise what it is, and they have thus created a litany of neutral-sounding groups with benign names: the Atlantic Council, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, various fact-checking outfits controlled by corporate media outlets that claim to employ anti-disinformation experts to identify and combat fake news, just as media corporations rebranded their partisan pundits as fact-checkers to masquerade their opinions as elevated, apolitical, authoritative decrees of expertise. The term disinformation expert is designed to disguise ideological views on behalf of state and corporate power centers as the official truth. Unbelievable to see these things happening in the United States of America. You have those who are telling us what truth is, and fact checkers basically promoting the opinion of people in places of power. And you'll see, throughout the body of this article, mentions of people like Soros and those who have tried to control the narrative of the world and prep the world for the Great Reset, and Klaus Schwab and others. are participants in this and wanting to control what it is that we are told is factual in these last days. It's just incredible the times that we live in. Well, that's all the time we have for today. And once again, I think it's important for us to underscore the fact that, these are things that are all pointing to what is going to be fulfilled during the tribulation. And as I said earlier, and it bears repeating, that the tribulation is of such a short duration. If you really want to think about it, you've got 3.5 years where these things are going to take place. So we see the man-made statue of the first beast that was killed and had a pseudo resurrection, and he's going to be worshipped and all that. But listen, once the abomination of desolation takes place, it's going to be the undiluted wrath of God. There will be no buying and selling, marrying and giving in marriage during the second half of the tribulation. It's just going to be chaos and people running for their lives, calling upon the mountains and the caves and hiding in the caves and the rocks, calling on the earth to hide them from the wrath of the Lamb and him who sits on the throne. So once again, we don't have an appointment with wrath as the Church of Jesus Christ in these last days. And we have a promise of being taken out of the way and being transformed, as we talked about a moment ago, in a moment and a twinkling of an eye, into immortal, incorruptible beings capable of eternal existence, also capable of returning with Jesus, as it says in Revelation 19, and on white horses, dressed in white linen, which is the righteous acts of the saints. Revelation 19:8 says, and ruling and reigning with him in righteousness for 1,000 years on this earth. So there is much to be excited about in the midst of all these very discouraging things or discouraging news, but there's always reason for us to have joy in our hearts and peace in our minds because Jesus has said it's going to be a mess when I'm coming to get you. And it's a mess right now. So he must be coming soon. Well, again, I just want to thank all of you who've been praying for me. And as I mentioned, I think before I had the surgery that, I had this done back in 2012 on my right hip. I had a congenital defect. My hip sockets didn't form properly and wore out both my hips ahead of time, so to speak. And, I had one type of surgery called the posterior method back in 2012, and the recovery was slow and very, very painful. And here, I had this anterior method, this new method that they use where they don't cut the muscles and they go in from the front side instead of the back side to basically cut off your femur and drive a rod down in it and put a new socket on top and a cup inside your hip socket and all these other things that are necessary to get the arthritic aspect relieved and get the bone on bone pain to be relieved. And it's just been amazing. I was thinking back, last time I was on a walker for 2 weeks. Well, I was 10 days after this surgery, and I was walking without a cane or a walker or anything. And that's how I am now. And so, obviously I'm still sore and all those things. They say it takes about 21 days for everything to solidify inside of your body where the surgical site is. So I would, again, covet your continued prayers and thank you for those who prayed thus far. And I'm really glad to be back doing this as I was last week. And as you can see, I made it the whole time, didn't have to stop short because of discomfort. And also really looking forward to being back at Calvary Chapel Tustin on Sunday. Again, if you'd like to join us, we'll be looking at Matthew 5:43 to 48. And just encourage you. And the subject is love. That's our word for the year at the church. And we've just been looking at different elements of it. So with that, that's all we have for today. I hope you were encouraged and enlightened a bit and reminded to keep looking up. Our redemption is nigh. Well, that's it for this week. So you know what that means. I'll see you either here, there, or in the air. God bless you.